My name is Harriet Williams, though most folks call me Hattie, and for 3 years I had been what they called a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading desperate souls through the swamplands and pine forests of South Carolina toward freedom. In the North, I had guided 47 people to safety before the night everything went wrong. The night when my mercy became my downfall and my capture became the beginning of something much larger than I ever imagined. Possible I was born free in Charleston, daughter of a freed carpenter and a seamstress who had bought her own liberation, with 20 years of saved pennies. But freedom papers meant little when slave catchers were paid bounties for any black person they could claim was runaway property. So I understood from childhood that my liberty was fragile as morning mist, and twice as likely to disappear without warning. The work chose me rather than the other way around. The first time I helped someone escape, it was pure instinct. Finding a terrified young woman named Lucy hiding in our church basement after she fled from a plantation where the overseer had been using her like his personal property. I couldn't turn her away, couldn't pretend I hadn't seen the desperation in her eyes or the marks on her body that told stories. No woman should have to live. Lucy made it to Philadelphia and sent word back through the network that she was safe, working as a seamstress and saving money to buy her sister's freedom. That letter changed my life because it proved that hope wasn't just a pretty word preachers used on Sunday mornings. It was something real you could hold in your hands and used to build a better world. After Lucy came Marcus, then the Johnson family with their 3 small children. Then old Ben, who had been saving for 30 years to escape before his arthritis made travel impossible. Each journey north was a masterpiece of planning and timing. Studying patrol schedules and safe houses, memorizing every creek and deer path. Through 50 miles of hostile territory, I learned to read the signs that marked a successful conductor. The subtle signals that meant safety or danger. The coded phrases that identified allies in a world where most white faces meant capture or death. I learned to move through forests like smoke, to hide groups of 10 or 12 people in spaces that seemed too small for one. To think 3 moves ahead of every possible threat. The network that supported my work was larger than most people realized, stretching from the docks of Charleston, where sailors would hide passengers in cargo holds, to farmhouses in North Carolina where Quaker families risked everything to provide shelter, to conductors in Virginia who would take over when my part of the journey was complete. But the most important part of the network was the people I was helping to escape. They became my eyes and ears on plantations throughout the region, sending word about which routes were being watched, which slave catchers were operating in which areas, which masters were planning to sell families that could be saved if we moved quickly enough. The work was dangerous beyond description. One mistake could mean death for everyone involved. Slave catchers carried guns and authorization to kill anyone who interfered with their property recovery. Masters posted rewards that would make poor white men rich for life if they could capture a conductor, and the new fugitive slave law meant that even in free states, anyone helping runaways could be imprisoned or worse. But danger was just another factor to calculate. Like weather or distance or the phase of the moon, what mattered was the look in people's eyes when they realized they might actually escape. The transformation from hopeless acceptance to desperate hope to fierce determination that made all the risks worthwhile. My downfall came because I broke my own cardinal rule about group size. The Johnson family had been joined by 2 other families, fleeing the same plantation after their master died and his heirs decided to sell everyone to settle debts. Suddenly, instead of 5 people, I was moving 11. Including 4 children under the age of 10. 11 people was too many for stealth, too many to hide effectively, too many to move quickly through the dangerous terrain between safe houses. But I couldn't bring myself to tell desperate families that they would have to wait for another opportunity that might never come. We made it through the first night successfully, reaching the safe house operated by Samuel and Ruth Patterson, a free black couple who ran a small farm 20 miles north of our starting point. Their place was a miracle of hidden spaces and secret passages. Rooms behind false walls where entire families could disappear while slave catchers searched the main house, but someone had been watching the Patterson farm. Someone had noticed the unusual activity and put together enough pieces to realize what was happening. On our second night there, we were surrounded by more armed men than I had ever seen in one place. Professional slave catchers backed up by local militia and bloodhounds that could track a scent for days. The attack came just before dawn when we thought we were safest. Boots thundering on the front porch while voices shouted demands for surrender. Children crying in terror while their parents tried to muffle the sounds that would give away our hiding place. The smell of smoke as someone set fire to the barn to flush us out. Come out now and nobody gets hurt. The leader called, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We know you're in there. We've been watching this place for weeks. Come out peaceful and maybe we'll go easy on you, but I knew there was no such thing as easy when it came to slave catchers. Knew that surrender meant chains and whips and probably death for some of the people I was supposed to protect, so I made the decision that sealed all our fates. I told the families to stay hidden while I drew the hunters away. I slipped out through the root cellar that connected to the creek bank. Emerging 50 yards from the house with my hands visible but my mind already calculating how to lead the pursuit away from the others. If I could make enough noise and give them a good chase, maybe the families could escape in the confusion. There she is. Someone shouted when they spotted me. That's the one. That's the conductor they call the Underground. Mother? The Underground Mother. I had never heard that name before, but it sent a chill through me because it meant my reputation had spread farther than I knew. Meant that professional bounty hunters had been specifically hunting for me. Meant that this wasn't a random discovery, but a carefully planned trap I ran through the pre-dawn darkness with a dozen men and twice as many dogs chasing after me, crashing through underbrush and splashing across streams in a desperate attempt to lead them far enough away to give the families time to escape. But the bloodhounds were relentless and my pursuers were experienced trackers. Who knew these woods as well as I did? They caught me at the creek where Lucy had first told me about the Underground Railroad, tackled me into the cold water and held me down until my lungs burned and my vision started to fade. When they finally dragged me to the surface, I was coughing up muddy water and my hands were already tied behind my back with rope that cut into my wrists. Harriet Williams, their leader, said, consulting a piece of paper, also known as Hattie. Also known as the Underground Mother, wanted for slave theft, property destruction, and conspiracy to violate the Fugitive Slave Act. There's a $500 reward. For your capture, $500 was more money than most men saw in a year. Enough to buy a small farm or start a business. Enough to make hunting me a worthwhile investment for professional slave catchers who made their living returning human property to its owners. What about the others? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. What others? The leader replied, with a grin that chilled my blood. Far as we know, you are working alone. Acting on your own without any help from anyone else. It was a lie designed to make me reveal information about my network. But it also gave me hope that maybe the families had escaped after all. Maybe my sacrifice had bought them the time they needed to reach the next safe house. They loaded me into a wagon with chains around my ankles and a gag in my mouth, beginning the long journey to Charleston, where I would be processed and sold to the highest bidder. But they weren't taking me to an ordinary slave market. They were taking me to Bannon's slave pen, the most notorious holding facility in the entire South. Bannon's was where they sent the troublemakers, the ones who had tried to escape or fight back or help others find freedom. It was a place designed to break spirits before selling bodies, to ensure that anyone who emerged from its walls would never again dream of resistance or rebellion. The wagon ride took 3 days through country. I had traveled many times as a free woman, but now saw through the eyes of someone headed for bondage. Every mile took me further from the life I had known and closer to a fate that might be worse than death. But even chained in the back of that wagon, even knowing that I was heading toward horrors I could barely imagine, I felt something growing inside me that wasn't fear or despair, but something harder and more dangerous. A determination that went beyond simple survival to something that might be called revolution. They thought they were taking me to be broken and sold. Art. But what they were really doing was giving me an education in the true nature of slavery that would transform me from a conductor. Helping individuals escape to something much more powerful and dangerous. I was about to learn that some people aren't meant to be saved one at a time. Some people are meant to save everyone. And sometimes it takes being thrown into hell to discover you have the strength to burn it down and build something better from. The ashes * Bannon's slave pen squatted on the Charleston waterfront like a cancerous growth. 3 stories of brick and iron that housed the human cargo waiting to be shipped to the cotton fields of Mississippi and Alabama. The building stank of unwashed bodies, fear and despair so thick you could taste it in the air, and the sounds that came from inside were the stuff of nightmares. They processed me like livestock when we arrived, stripping away my clothes and dignity, while men in expensive suits examined my teeth and muscles and scars, writing down descriptions and estimated values in ledgers that reduced my entire existence to a few lines of profitable text. Strong build, good teeth, some scarring on the back from previous discipline. The clerk read aloud as he made his notes. Literate according to the bounty notice, which makes her valuable for housework but dangerous for field placement. Recommend sale to Deep South cotton plantation where literacy won't be a problem. The Deep South meant death. Slow and brutal and inevitable. It meant working in conditions that killed most people within 5 years. Meant never again seeing anything but cotton, and overseers and the business end of a whip. It meant disappearing into a system designed to consume human beings and turn them into profit. They threw me into a cell on the 2nd floor with 12 other women. Most of them recent captors like myself who had committed the crime of wanting freedom. The space was barely 8 feet by 10 feet with no windows and only a bucket in the corner for sanitation. We slept on straw that hadn't been changed in months and ate thin gruel that barely kept us alive. My cellmates were a collection of broken spirits and fierce resistance. Women who had run away from masters who raped them, mothers who had tried to keep their children from being sold, wives who had followed husbands only to be captured and separated forever. Each had a story that illustrated the casual cruelty of a system that treated human beings like farm animals. You're the underground. Mother, whispered a young woman named Rose, who had been caught trying to reach her daughter in North Carolina. I heard about you from my cousin who made it to Philadelphia last year. Said you were the bravest woman in South Carolina. Brave gets you thrown in here just like stupid does. I replied, but I could see hope kindling in her eyes and the eyes of the other women. Brave don't keep you from ending up chained in a slave pen waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. But you've got 47 people to freedom, Rose insisted. 47 souls who are walking around free because of what you did. That's gotta count for something. It did count for something. But sitting in that fetid cell, listening to the sounds of suffering that never stopped, it was hard to remember what. The screams from the men's section echoed through the walls day and night, punctuated by the crack of whips and the casual laughter of guards, who found entertainment in other people's pain. The worst part wasn't the physical conditions, though they were deliberately designed to be as degrading as possible. The worst part was the psychological warfare. The systematic attempt to convince us that resistance was futile, that we deserved whatever happened to us. That hope itself was a luxury. We could no longer afford every morning they would call out names of people who had been sold. Families torn apart as mothers were shipped to Georgia while their children went to Alabama. Husbands separated from wives, who would never see each other again. The randomness of it was part of the torture. Never knowing if today was the day your name would be called. The trick is not to think about it, advised an older woman named Mama Jean, who had been in the pen for 6 months after being caught helping her grandchildren escape. You got to put your mind somewhere else, somewhere they can't reach. Or this place will drive you crazy before they get around to selling you. But I found I couldn't stop thinking. Couldn't turn off the part of my mind that was always planning. And calculating, even here in this nightmare, I was studying the guard rotations, mapping the building's layout, looking for weaknesses that might be exploited by someone desperate enough to try. Guards were mostly poor white men who took the job because it paid better than factory work and gave them power over people they had been taught to hate. Were cruel but not particularly bright, following routines that hadn't changed in years. Assuming that chained and demoralized prisoners posed no real threat, I learned that the building had been a warehouse before being converted to a slave pen, which meant there were structural features that didn't make sense for a prison. Old loading, doors that had been bricked up but not reinforced, ventilation shafts that connected different floors, storage areas that weren't regularly inspected. More importantly, I learned that there were other people in the pen who hadn't given up hope. Men and women who had been planning resistance even in the face of impossible odds. They recognized something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself, a quality that went beyond simple determination to something that might be called leadership. "You're different from the others," said Marcus, a man who had been caught trying to buy his wife's freedom and ended up being enslaved himself. "You got that look, that way of seeing things that makes people want to follow you." "Follow me where?" I asked. "We're chained in cells, waiting to be sold. There's nowhere to go, even if we could get out. There's always somewhere to go, if you're willing to pay the price," Marcus replied, "and there's always a way out if you're smart enough to find it. Question is whether you're ready to stop thinking like someone who rescues people one at a time and start thinking like someone who could rescue everyone." The word hung in the stifling air of our cell like a challenge. Was it possible to organize something large enough to free not just a few individuals but entire groups? To strike a blow against the system itself, rather than just helping people escape from Eindhoven the following weeks. I began to see Bannon's slave pen differently, not as a prison designed to break us, but as a concentration of some of the most motivated people in the South. Men and women who had already proven their willingness to risk everything for freedom, who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. We started meeting in the exercise yard. Small groups that looked like casual conversation but were actually planning sessions, sharing information about the building's layout, card schedules, delivery times, anything that might be useful for someone planning the impossible. "The loading dock opens every Tuesday and Friday for supply deliveries," reported Sarah, a woman who worked in the kitchen and could move around the building more freely than the rest of us. "They bring the wagons right up to the dock and leave them unguarded. While they unload, guard shift change happens at 6 in the evening," added Thomas, who had been timing the routines for weeks. "For about 15 minutes, there's only half the usual number of men watching the exits. Auction days are Wednesdays," contributed Mary, who had been in the pen longer than anyone. "They move people out early in the morning, which means the cells are less crowded and the guards are distracted." Piece by piece, we assembled a picture of how the slave pen operated, where its vulnerabilities were when opportunities might arise. But more importantly, we began to function as a unit. People who had never met before the pen, becoming a coordinated group with a shared purpose. The breakthrough came when I realized that our greatest weakness was also our greatest strength. They had put all the troublemakers in one place, all the people who refused to accept slavery as their permanent condition, all the natural leaders and organizers who might otherwise have been scattered across dozens of plantations. "We're not planning an escape," I told the group during one of our yard meetings. "We're planning a liberation, not just getting ourselves out, but taking everyone, every soul in this place, and not just running away, but fighting back." "Fighting with what?" asked James, a blacksmith, who understood the practical problems better than most. "We got no weapons, no supplies, no way to arm ourselves against guards with guns. We've got numbers," I replied, "got knowledge of this building, and we've got the element of surprise. They expect us to be broken and hopeless. They don't expect us to be organized and determined." And after we get out, Rose wanted to know, what then? Where do we go with 50 or 60 people? How do we keep from being recaptured within a day? We don't run. I said, the words coming from someplace deep inside me, that I was only beginning to recognize. We fight, we hit other pens, other auctions, other places where our people are being held. If we become something they can't ignore or contain, you're talking about war. Marcus said quietly, open war against the whole system. The system's already at war with us, I replied, has been since the first slave ship reached these shores. All I'm talking about is fighting back instead of just running away. The planning took months. Careful preparation that had to be hidden from the guards while we worked out every detail of timing and coordination. We identified the strongest fighters, the best planners, the people who could be counted on to follow orders when chaos erupted. But the most important thing we planned wasn't the escape itself, but what came after. How to turn a jailbreak into the beginning of something larger. How to use our freedom not just to save ourselves, but to save others. How to become the spark that would set fire to the entire rotten system when we break out of here. I told the group the night before we were scheduled to act. We're not just escaping, we're declaring war. We're announcing that there are people in this state who refuse to accept slavery as permanent, who are willing to fight and die to end it, and if we fail, asked Sarah, if they kill us all or capture us and make examples of us, then we die. As free people fighting for justice instead of slaves waiting to be sold, I replied. And maybe our deaths will inspire others to pick up where we left off that night. I lay on my straw mattress, listening to the sounds of 50 other people preparing themselves mentally for what might be their last day alive. And I felt something settle in my chest that was bigger than fear or hope or anger. Something that might have been destiny. Tomorrow, we would discover whether the underground mother could become something more than a conductor helping individuals escape. Whether she could become a general leading an army of liberation. Whether mercy could be transformed into justice and justice into revolution. The rebellion began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when the supply wagons arrived at the loading dock. Exactly as we had planned for 3 months. But what none of us expected was how quickly individual acts of resistance would cascade into something that felt less like an escape and more like divine retribution finally arriving to balance the scales of justice. Sai had spent the night before going from cell to cell, whispering final instructions and seeing the same mixture of terror and determination in every face. We all understood that many of us would die before the sun set. But we also understood that living as we had been wasn't really living at all, remember? I told each group, we move fast, we move together, and we don't leave anyone behind. This isn't about saving ourselves. It's about proving that our people can fight back. That slavery isn't something we have to accept forever. The signal came when Thomas, who worked in the kitchen, dropped a pot in the hallway outside the guard station. The crash echoed through the building and brought 2 guards running to investigate, leaving only 1 man watching the main cell block, exactly as we had predicted. Marcus had been working on his cell lock for weeks with a piece of metal he'd stolen from the kitchen, and when the guard's attention was distracted, he managed to pick the mechanism and slip into the hallway. Within minutes, he had freed my cell and we were moving through the building like smoke. Silent and deadly and absolutely committed to our cause. The guard station held the keys to every cell in the building, but it also held the weapons we would need to fight our way out. 2 rifles, a half-dozen pistols, and enough ammunition to arm our strongest fighters. The single guard on duty never had a chance to raise an alarm before Marcus put him down with a blow that was harder than necessary, but exactly as hard as justice demanded. Keys. I whispered to Sarah as we stripped the guard station of everything useful. Get every cell opened, everyone armed who can fight. Everyone ready to move. The sound of 50 cell doors opening created a noise like thunder rolling through the building, followed by the voices of people who had given up hope suddenly, discovering that freedom might be possible after all. Men and women who had been broken by months of captivity suddenly transforming into an army of liberation. But the noise also brought the rest of the guards running. And within minutes, the slave pen erupted into a battle that would be talked about. For decades, armed slaves fighting trained guards in corridors designed to contain rather than defend. Desperation meeting discipline in a clash that shook the building to its foundations. Take the loading dock. I shouted over the gunfire, secure. The exit. Get the wagons ready. Some of our people had never held weapons before. But they fought with the fury of souls who had nothing left to lose, while others, like James the blacksmith and Marcus the carpenter, handled guns like they had been born to warfare, their shots finding targets with deadly precision. The guards were better armed and better trained. But they had never faced desperate people who were fighting for something more important than their own lives. They fell back toward the main entrance while we advanced through the building, freeing everyone we found and adding their strength to our growing force. The children. Rose called out as we passed the cells where they kept the youngest prisoners. We can't leave the children. We're not leaving anyone, I replied, directing a group to gather up the dozen children who had been captured with their families. Everyone comes with us. Everyone gets their chance at freedom. The battle for the slave pen lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime of violence compressed into moments of pure chaos. When the smoke cleared, we controlled the building and had freed every person inside. 73 souls who had been marked for sale to the Deep South were suddenly armed and dangerous and absolutely determined never to be enslaved again. What now? Asked Marcus, as we stood in the loading dock surrounded by wagons we had commandeered and weapons we had taken from our former captors. Where do we go from here? We go to war, I replied, and I could see understanding dawn in the faces around me. We hit the auction house, the other slave pens, every place in this city where our people are being held. We don't stop until everyone is free. Charleston's slave market was only 6 blocks from Bannon's pen. Close enough for us to reach before word of our rebellion could spread, but far enough to give us time to plan our next assault. The auction house held another 50 people scheduled to be sold that morning, including families that had been separated at other facilities. 73 of us against however many guards they have, calculated James. Plus whatever militia they can muster once they realize what's happening. They won't be expecting us. I pointed out they'll think we're runaways trying to escape the city, not revolutionaries trying to liberate it. The assault on Ryan's auction house was swift and brutal. We struck just as the morning auction was beginning, while buyers and sellers were focused on the human merchandise being displayed on the platform. Our gunfire echoed through the building like the voice of justice finally speaking loud enough to be heard. Everyone down, I shouted as our fighters poured through. The entrances, buyers on the ground, auctioneers on the ground. Anyone who tries to stop us dies. The wealthy planters who had come to buy human beings cowered on the floor while we freed their intended purchases. 73 liberators becoming 123 in the space of minutes, our ranks swelling with people who had been resigned to slavery, suddenly finding themselves part of an army of freedom. Of our success at the auction house brought consequences we hadn't fully anticipated. Word of our rebellion spread through Charleston like wildfire, and by afternoon the entire city was mobilizing against us. Militia units marching through the streets while church bells rang warnings that the slaves were rising. They'll have the roads blocked by evening, Marcus warned as we counted our new recruits and distributed weapons taken from the auction house guards. Every exit from the city will be guarded. They'll try to trap us here and starve us out, then we don't try to leave. I decided. We stay and fight. We make Charleston itself into our battlefield. We show every slave in South Carolina that resistance is possible. You're talking about holding an entire city, protested Thomas. We're not an army. We're escaped slaves with a few stolen weapons. We're free people defending our right to be free. I corrected him, and we're fighting on ground we know better than they do. We know every alley and basement and hiding place in this city. We know which white folks might help us and which ones will definitely try to kill us. The next phase of our rebellion required us to think like generals rather than escaped prisoners, to consider strategy and logistics and the political implications of every action we took. Charleston was a major port city with thousands of slaves and hundreds of free blacks. You might be willing to join our cause if we could prove that victory. Was possible the docks suggested Rose, who had worked as a house slave for a family near the harbor. If we can control the docks, we can prevent reinforcements from arriving by sea. And maybe we can get word to the abolitionists up north about what we're doing here, the arsenal. Added James, there's a state militia arsenal on Meeting Street with enough weapons to arm a real army. If we could take that one thing at a time, I cautioned, though my mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities they were describing. First, we secure our base, make sure everyone has shelter and food and ammunition. Then we start thinking about expanding our operations. We chose the old warehouse district near the Cooper River as our headquarters. Buildings that had been abandoned during a recent economic downturn but still had solid walls and good sightlines. More importantly, they were connected by a network of alleys and passages that would allow us to move unseen through that part of the city. The transformation of our group from desperate escapees to organized fighters happened faster than any of us had expected. People who had been beaten down by slavery suddenly discovered reserves of strength and courage they hadn't known. They possessed, while others revealed skills and knowledge that proved invaluable for our military operations. I used to work in a gunsmith's shop, revealed a man named David who had been freed from the auction house. I can maintain weapons, make ammunition, even build simple explosives if we can get the materials. I know which families in the city might help us. Added a woman named Catherine, free blacks who have money and connections. White folks who belong to the abolition societies. People who talk about ending slavery but haven't had a chance to do anything about it by evening we had established. A defensible position and begun recruiting from the thousands of slaves who worked in Charleston's homes and businesses. Our message was simple but powerful. Freedom was possible if people were willing to fight for it. And we had proven that even the most secure slave facilities could be taken by determined fighters. Tomorrow, they'll come for us in force, told the assembled crowd as darkness fell over our makeshift fortress. Militia, maybe federal troops, certainly every bounty hunter and slave catcher in the state. They'll try to crush us before news of what we've done can spread to other cities. And what do we do when they come? Asked Marcus. We show them that the age of slavery is ending. I replied that there are people in this state who refuse to accept bondage as permanent. That freedom isn't something you ask for politely, something you take with blood and courage and absolute determination that night. As I walked among the 123 people we had liberated, listening to them plan and prepare and share stories of the families they hoped to reunite with, I realized that something fundamental had changed in me during our months in the slave Panay. Was no longer the underground mother who helped individuals escape one at a time. I had become something larger and more dangerous, something that the slaveholders would have nightmares about for generations. I had become the people's liberator, and my war against slavery was just beginning. The siege of Charleston began at dawn on Wednesday when federal troops surrounded our warehouse district with artillery pieces and enough soldiers to occupy a small country. But by then our rebellion had spread far beyond what any of us had imagined. Possible slaves were rising on plantations throughout the Low Country, while free blacks and white abolitionists provided supplies and intelligence that kept us one step ahead of our enemies. I stood on the roof of our main building watching the army deploy around us. And instead of fear, I felt something like satisfaction. They were taking us seriously enough to bring cannons, which meant our message about resistance was being heard loud and clear by every slaveholder in South Carolina. Looks like half the state militia, observed Marcus, studying the troops through a spyglass we had taken from the auction house. Plus federal soldiers, plus God knows how many volunteers who want to collect bounties on our heads. Good, I replied. The more soldiers they waste trying to crush us, the fewer they have available to hunt down the people escaping from plantations all over the state, because that was what was happening. Our rebellion in Charleston had become the spark that ignited resistance movements across the entire region. Plantations where slaves had been planning escapes for years suddenly found the courage to act, while others who had never dreamed of freedom began to see it as possible. Reports reached us through a network of runners and sympathizers that had emerged organically as word of our liberation spread. Slaves were walking off the Middleton plantation in groups of 20 and 30. The rice fields along the Ashley River were being abandoned as entire work crews headed for the swamps. Even house slaves in the wealthiest districts were disappearing. In the night, it's like a fever, reported Catherine, who maintained contact with free Black communities throughout the city. People who never showed any interest in resistance are suddenly willing to risk everything. They're calling you the Moses of South Carolina, saying you're leading our people out of bondage, Moses. It's the biblical liberator who had led the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. It was a powerful comparison, but also a dangerous one, because it raised expectations that might be impossible to fulfill. People were looking to me not just for leadership, but for miracles. I'm not Moses. I told the council of fighters who had emerged as my lieutenants, I'm just someone who got tired of watching. Our people suffer and decided to do something about it. But maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all it takes to change the world. The first assault came at noon. They tried to storm our positions with infantry supported by artillery fire. But we had spent days preparing our defenses, and our fighters knew they were battling for more than their own lives. They were fighting for the future of their children, and their children's children hold the line. I called out as bullets shattered windows and cannonballs punched holes in our walls. Make them pay for every inch. Show them that free people fight harder than slaves ever could. The battle raged for 3 hours before the federal forces pulled back to regroup, leaving behind dozens of casualties and the growing realization that we weren't the disorganized rabble they had expected to find. We were a disciplined fighting force with clear objectives and the will to achieve them. They'll try siege tactics next, predicted James, who had emerged as our best military strategist. Cut off our supplies, wait for us to run out of ammunition and food. Try to starve us into surrender, then we don't wait for them to starve us. I decided, we break out before they can complete their encirclement. Take the fight to them instead of letting them dictate the terms. Break out to where? Astros, the whole city is crawling with troops. There's nowhere to run. Even if we could get past their lines, we're not running, I explained. We're expanding, taking more ground, liberating more people, turning this rebellion into something they can't contain or crush. The breakout began at midnight, when small groups of our fighters slipped through the federal lines and struck targets throughout Charleston, hitting slave pens and auction houses and the homes of prominent slave dealers. Each assault carefully planned to free more people while avoiding unnecessary casualties. By dawn, we had rescued another 200 people and established secondary positions in 3 different parts of the city, forcing the federal forces to spread their strength while our ranks continued to grow with every successful operation. We're not fighting a battle anymore, I told the expanded council as we planned our next moves. We're fighting a revolution. And revolutions succeed when they inspire more people to join than the enemy can capture or kill. The federal government is sending more troops, warned David, who monitored the telegraph lines for intelligence about enemy movements. Regiments from Georgia and North Carolina. They're treating this like a full-scale rebellion. That's because it is a full-scale rebellion. I replied, we've gone beyond escape and rescue to something that threatens the entire system of slavery. And they know that if we succeed here, uprisings will spread to every state in the South. The reports reaching us confirmed that our rebellion was already inspiring resistance far beyond South Carolina. Slaves were escaping in record numbers throughout the region, while abolitionists provided unprecedented levels of support for Underground Railroad operations. Virginia is reporting massive runaway activity, said Catherine, who maintained communication with free Black networks throughout the South. Same with North Carolina and Georgia. It's like our success here has convinced people everywhere that freedom is actually possible, and that means we can't afford to fail. I pointed out too many people are counting on us to prove that organized resistance can succeed, that slavery isn't permanent, that our people can fight back and win. The decisive battle came 2 weeks into the siege when we launched a coordinated assault on the state militia arsenal, capturing enough weapons to arm a small army while demonstrating that no facility was secure from determined fighters with these weapons. I told the crowd of nearly 500 freed people who had joined our cause, "We can hold Charleston indefinitely, or we can march on Columbia, or we can split into smaller groups and liberate every plantation between here and Virginia. What do you recommend?" asked Marcus, who had become my second in command during the weeks of fighting. "I recommend we become what they fear most," I replied, my voice carrying across the assembled crowd of fighters. "We become proof that slavery cannot be maintained when people refuse to accept it. We become the army of liberation that every slaveholder has nightmares about the decision." To divide our forces and spread the rebellion across multiple states was both strategic and symbolic. We would demonstrate that resistance could not be contained by surrounding one city or crushing one group of fighters. That the spirit of freedom we had awakened would continue to spread no matter what they did to us individually. 100 fighters head north into North Carolina, I announced. Hit the plantations along the Cape Fear River. Free everyone you can and keep moving. Don't let them pin you down in any one place. Another 100 go west toward Columbia, I continued. Liberate the slave markets there and establish a base in the interior. Show them that no part of this state is safe from our operations and the rest of us, asked Rose, who would be leading one of the expeditionary forces. The rest of us head south into Georgia. I said, take our message to the rice plantations and cotton fields. Turn individual escapes into mass liberty. Build an army that can march on Savannah or Augusta or wherever the need is greatest. The transformation from desperate escapees to revolutionary generals had taken only months. But it felt like we had compressed a lifetime of growth and learning into those intense weeks of planning and fighting. People who had never held weapons before were now training others in military tactics, while former house slaves were making strategic decisions that affected thousands of lives before we separate. I told the group on our last night together, in Charleston, I want everyone to understand what we've accomplished here. We've proven that slavery is not permanent, that our people can organize and fight and win. That freedom is not something we have to beg for, but something we can take. And if some of us don't survive, asked Thomas, voicing the fear that haunted all of us, then we'll have died as free people fighting for justice, I replied. And our deaths will inspire others to continue the fight until every chain is broken and every auction block is burned to the ground. The dispersal of our forces marked the end of the Charleston phase of our rebellion, but it was also the beginning of something much larger. Within 6 months, there were armed groups of liberated slaves operating in 7 states, each carrying our message that resistance was possible and freedom was achievable. Led the Southern Expedition into Georgia, where the rice plantations along the coast provided both strategic targets and natural allies. Slaves who worked in the swamps and tidal marshes had knowledge of terrain that made them nearly impossible to track, while their experience with boats and navigation proved invaluable for moving people and supplies. The Blackwood plantation has 300 people, reported scouts who had been gathering intelligence for weeks. Heavily guarded, but the guards are spread thin over a large area. If we hit them at harvest time when everyone's in the fields, we could free the entire population before reinforcements arrive. And take them where? Asked Marcus, who had chosen to accompany my group south. 300 people can't disappear into the swamps, and we can't move them north without a supply line. We don't move them north, I explained. We establish them as a liberated community. Right here in Georgia, we take enough plantations to create a free territory that we can defend. A place where escaped slaves can come to live as free people. The concept of liberated territory was revolutionary. Instead of helping individuals escape to distant free states, we would create free states here in the heart of slave country. Demonstrate that large populations could live and work without masters, that the entire economic system of slavery was unnecessary. You're talking about creating a black republic in the middle of Georgia, said James, who understood the political implications better than most. I'm talking about creating what should have existed all along. I replied, communities where people can live according to their own choices, where children grow up free, where no one has to fear being sold away from their families. The liberation of the Blackwood plantation succeeded beyond our wildest expectations. Not only did we free all 300 people, but we captured enough weapons and supplies to establish a fortified settlement that could defend itself against raids while serving as a base for further operations. They're calling it New Africa, reported Catherine, who maintained communication. Between our scattered groups, newspapers as far north as Boston are writing about the freed slave community in Georgia that's operating like an independent nation. New Africa became a beacon for escaped slaves throughout the region. People walked hundreds of miles to reach a place where they could live without fear of capture, where their children could learn to read and write, where families could stay together and make their own decisions about their futures. But our success also brought increased attention from federal authorities, who recognized that our liberated territories posed an existential threat to slavery itself. If we could prove that large populations of freed slaves could be self-sufficient and prosperous, it would undermine every argument used to justify bondage. They're organizing a massive expedition against us, warned David, who monitored military communications, federal troops, state militias, volunteer units from multiple states. They're treating us like a foreign country that needs to be conquered. Good, I replied. That means they understand we're not just escaped slaves anymore. We're a nation of free people defending our right to exist. The final confrontation came in the spring of 1857, when federal forces launched a coordinated assault on all our liberated territories simultaneously, attempting to crush the rebellion before it could spread to other regions. But by then, our movement had grown beyond anything they could contain or defeat. We've got nearly 2,000 fighters spread across 4 states, reported Marcus during our last council meeting before the assault. Plus, civilian populations in our liberated areas that are willing to fight to defend their freedom. And we've got something else. I added, we've got the knowledge that we did this, that we took people who were considered property and turned them into an army, that we created free communities in the heart of slave territory, that we proved slavery could be ended if enough people were willing to fight for freedom. The battle for New Africa lasted 3 days and nights. Federal artillery pounding our fortifications while our fighters held every position with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant not just death but the return of everyone we had liberated to the auction blocks and plantations. They had escaped when the smoke cleared and the federal forces withdrew to regroup. We still held our territory, but more importantly, we had demonstrated that freed slaves could match professional soldiers in battle. That determination and justice were forces that could not be easily defeated. What now? Asked Rose as we counted our casualties and prepared for the next assault. Now we've won. I replied, not the war, maybe, but something more important. We've proven that our people can be free, that slavery is not permanent. That resistance is not only possible, but inevitable. You think they'll come back? Asked Thomas. They'll keep coming until slavery itself is ended. I said, but that's not our problem anymore. Our job was to prove it could be done, to show that the Underground Railroad was just the beginning. That liberation was possible on a scale no one had imagined. The reports that reached us over the following months confirmed that our rebellion had succeeded in ways we never anticipated. Slave escapes increased dramatically throughout the South, while abolitionists found new support for their cause. The Underground Railroad expanded into a network of military-style operations that federal authorities struggled to contain. They're calling you the Black Napoleon. Catherine told me, reading from a northern newspaper, saying you revolutionized the fight against slavery by turning individual escapes into mass liberations. I'm not Napoleon, I replied. I'm just someone who got tired of saving people one at a time and decided to save them by the hundreds instead. But that wasn't entirely true. The woman who had been thrown into Bannon's slave pen for helping fugitives had been transformed by suffering and struggle into something larger. something that slaveholders would fear and freed people would remember for generations. I was Harriet Williams, the underground mother who became the people's liberator. The conductor who became a general. The woman who proved that some prisons exist not to hold their victims but to forge them into weapons of justice. The slave pen had been designed to break my spirit and prepare me for sail to the deep south. But instead, it had given me an education in the true nature of oppression and the power of organized resistance. It had taken someone who saved individuals and transformed her into someone who could save nations. My story would be told in whispered conversations in slave quarters throughout the South, sung in coded spirituals that carried messages of hope and resistance. Remembered as proof that no system of oppression is permanent when people refuse to accept it as inevitably. Had been thrown into hell and emerged as the leader of an army. Captured as a criminal and returned as a liberator, broken by my enemies and reforged by my own determination into something they could never defeat or contain. The Underground Railroad had been just the beginning. The first gentle rain before the storm that would eventually wash slavery from the American landscape forever. And I had been privileged to help turn that rain into a flood that would drown the auction blocks and slave pens in a tide of freedom and justice standing in New Africa, surrounded by people who lived as proof that liberation was possible. I understood that my real work was finished. I had planted seeds that would grow into forests, lit fires that would spread across continents, proved that the dream of freedom was not a dream at all, but a destiny that could be achieved by anyone willing to pay the price. Woman who had once hidden individual fugitives in root cellars and barn lofts had become the general of an army of liberation, and that army would continue to grow until every chain was broken and every person was free.